I'm conscious, just with time, we've gone over the 10 minutes, but I'm conscious that you had your hand up from very early on, so we'll come back to the next round. Could we move on to the next speakers, and if it comes up, if this issue on fiscal matters is still very much live at that point on the two presentations, we can bring it in as well. So we'll pass over to James.
So thanks very much, Dan. So in this little session here, I'm going to look at some issues in relation to current and capital expenditure. Perhaps first start at sort of an aggregate level in the economy before looking at the differences and patterns between them in a government setting and a public setting. And I suppose as the day has progressed, we've sort of been welcomed by the success that the day has had. And I was just during the break there, I noticed that the Twitter feed has been spammed, so I think undoubtedly an event is a success if it's attracting that much attention. But just to start with this picture here, which I suppose needs no introduction, that being the GDP pattern of Ireland for the last number of years. I've done the statistician's cheat and affected the axis, so the drop isn't as dramatic as would be suggested here. But overall, we had a drop of about 17% in nominal GDP over the past 3 or 4 years. So looking at this, what has been the driving cause of the drop from about 189 billion at the peak in 2007 to just under 156 billion in 2010, with most estimates that nominal GDP will be largely unchanged or maybe a small drop for 2011. So looking at one of the components that I'll focus on, that being investment, and here the drop isn't being influenced by the choice of access. This graph starts at 0 and shows us investment in Ireland for the past 9 years up to 2010. The starting point 2002 is just the start of the data. There is no significant point to the starting point. It just goes as far as the CSO have provided data on an institute or on a sector basis, so we can break down who has done the investing in the economy and what's been happening in the different sectors. So investment in Ireland nominally peaked in 2007. About 48 billion, when our GDP was 189 billion, was made up of investment, gross fixed capital investment, and that has dropped like a stone over the last number of years and dropped below 20 billion in 2010. Perhaps we felt it couldn't get any lower. We've just tracked the aggregates in the quarterly national accounts that have been released so far for 2011. Investment in 2011 will be lower yet again. Much of the drop we saw in the Q3, when there was a return to negative growth for Q3, was driven by investment. Across the other components of GDP, there was relative stability, not a lot happening, neither going up nor going down, but investment continued to plummet. So the change in investment has been quite dramatic, and the change here is about 30 billion. So with a drop in nominal GDP of maybe 35 billion, this is telling a lot of the story. There has been changes in the other components. Clearly consumption and the contribution of government current expenditure have been negative, and they've been largely offset by the change in net exports driven by the activities of the multinational sector. So if we look at the CSO's breakdown by sector, who was doing the investment that got us up to 48 billion, who has stopped investing has dropped us down to less than 20. We can see that the dominant sector in terms of the increase was the household sector. Right through the decade where investment was increasing, it was driven by the household sector. Increase in fixed capital investment, basically buying new houses or investing in improvements in existing houses. So that drove investment from just over 10 billion to over 25 billion in the household sector. The changes in the other two categories weren't that dramatic. Business investment, both non-financial and financial, although mainly non-financial, did increase and has dropped quite dramatically. And government investment, being the lowest of the three, doesn't show huge changes in the numbers, but in relative terms has shown substantial changes. So the main reason for the increase was the household sector. So when investment shot up and went at huge rates, it was us buying new houses. That was what was contributing to the growth in investment, and that then has dropped quite dramatically. So the household sector has gone from being the largest source of investment in the economy to the smallest source in a very rapid period of time, in a period of just 3 or 4 years. The other two sectors have dropped as well. One impact of this is how much are we actually adding to the capital stock that we have, say, purchasing and additions to the capital stock, but you also have depreciation, the wearing out of what we already have. And if we're not investing sufficient to cover depreciation, what exactly is happening? And we can see in two of the sectors that one is just barely covering depreciation. Household investment has dropped to the stage where it's approaching zero if we look at net investment, and in the business sector it's negative. So that drop has taken investment in the business sector below negative. The one sector that is adding to the capital stock, or at least was up to 2010, is the government sector. And although there had been a drop in investment, it wasn't dropping below the wear and the depreciation of the existing stock of assets that the state had, that the government had. So the drop in GDP, if you want to look and pinpoint one particular sector, what has caused it, has been driven hugely by a drop in investment. And we can look at different reasons as to why that happened, maybe different policy responses. But clearly it's not, in the traditional sense, responding to interest rates. If you cut interest rates, you might be able to stimulate or generate investment. In 2007, 2008, the ECB rate got up to 4.25%. It's dropped and been relatively low for most of that period. It's now at record lows of 1%. So the interest rate isn't sufficient to stimulate investment, particularly in the household and firm sector, which perhaps would be more responsive to interest rates and perhaps might take a shorter term view. Maybe the government could take a longer term view and wouldn't be as determined by activities on the interest rate side of things. Just looking at what we invested in, again, the CSO break it down. Clearly, when we look at the household sector, the key area for investment in the household sector will be houses. So dwellings dominates our investment. So purchasing new houses and improvements in existing ones. And that's mainly what drove the increase again. The other sectors, a bit of noise going on, not a lot happening. But really the dramatic drop in our GDP is hugely influenced by the collapse in the property sector. That activity has gone from being way overheated to virtually stopped. And that has caused a dramatic drop across a whole range of sectors in the economy. That the activity here has had knock-on effects elsewhere. If we just want to isolate one that's happening at the bottom, there's this category that's other. In fact, that other is made up of 80% costs involved in transfer of land and buildings. So it's again related to the property sector, and that got up over 5 billion in 2006, related to legal issues in terms of transfer, leases, the creation, the purchase of leases, the purchase of freehold leases from leasehold agreements, and they added substantially to the capital stock. They were generating an asset that could be used, and again that activity has dropped. So across a whole range of areas, the impact on our national accounts and our GDP figures are quite substantial. So when looking at the overall economy, we clearly will get a lot of emphasis on what's happening on the current side, be it current government expenditure, current expenditure by households, but by far the greatest changes have been on the capital side, that we've stopped spending in most areas for investment in fixed capital. If we look at the government sector, which is where we're going to focus on, the start there is to sort of introduce what it is we're looking at. So looking at the CSO's data on government investment over the past 7 or 8 years up to 2010, we can see the gap between the amount of money the government was spending, and we'll look in more detail at what the government spends its fixed capital budget on, and the depreciation that was occurring. So that's the actual data we have. We can make a fair guess about what public investment was in 2011. We can look at the exchequer return, and then we also have the medium-term fiscal framework to tell us, well, what's planned for the next number of years, given the constraints we find ourselves in, the spending envelopes that we've laid out, how much money we're going to spend, how much of that is going to go on public investment on the capital stock. So what decline we've had over the last number of years is largely set to continue. That with public investment peaking at about 9 billion in 2008, it's going to drop to about 3 billion over the period from 2013, 2014, 2015. So a drop of 60%. When looking at the impact this has, I turn to my wife who's an accountant and says, what did the CSO, where did they get this depreciation line from? I don't really know where it comes from. So she spoke for 5 minutes. I heard 2 words, straight line. The rest of it sort of went over my head. Didn't know what she was talking about. It seemed sensible and she seemed to know what she was going on about. So when getting depreciation, all I basically drew was a straight line. So I put it across. She did look disapprovingly, but walked away. So we can see that what will happen over time when the amount of capital investment declines, that not only do we have a business sector that has its capital stock declining, a household sector that has simply stopped investing, the government sector is pretty much planning on getting into the same situation over the next number of years as well, given the drops we see here. So the issue is, looking at this, are we putting ourselves in a negative position? I'll forget that one for 1 minute. So we'll change the shape of the slides and look at it more externally. How do we compare to other Eurozone countries? So this graph has a lot of noise, but it's just basically the Eurozone countries and their investment as a percentage of GDP. It also includes 2 additional countries. Denmark should be there, a small country outside the Eurozone, though their interest rate policy is largely in line with the ECB rate, and our nearest neighbour, the UK. So this is an average from the period when our GDP was increasing. So it's investment as a proportion of GDP from 2002 to 2007. What we're largely interested in is the position of Ireland. So over that 6-year period, Ireland ranked 6th, and we can get the breakdown and we look at the different investments that took place, but we've already seen who was doing most of the investment. So the 17 countries there, Malta's at the bottom because they don't have anybody to collect the data, given the small size of the economy. They don't send the data to Eurostat, but all other countries contribute, but in some cases the series aren't complete. So while it is an average over the 6 years, I wouldn't be depending on my life on the validity of the numbers, because some of the countries only have 3 or 4 observations. But for Ireland, it starts in 2002 and does for most of the main countries. So if you rank it by overall investment as a proportion of GDP, we come in 5th. If we rank it relative to government investment, we come in 2nd. So this is just changing the ordering, changing the ranking. The blue being government investment as a proportion of GDP. So only Estonia had a higher proportion. So our government investment relative to GDP was quite high. If we rank it relative to the household sector, we also here are quite high. So the only change here is that it's relative to the household sector. And finally, just the business sector, we come 3rd from the end. So you rank it, Estonia has the largest red bar there, Slovakia, Slovenia. If you look at business investment, investment from corporations, financial and non-financial as a percentage of GDP, we were 3rd last. So with very high investment as a proportion of GDP in the Euros on average, but for 2 categories, for the government and for the households. From the business sector, investment was quite low, and we're right down towards the bottom. So in an aggregate sense, we'd say, look, lots of investment taking place. If you look at the particular sectors in which it's occurring, there is a difference. 2 sectors taking us up near the top, 1 sector dragging us down towards the bottom. And if you look at what's happening in the last 3 years, so this is the average for 2008 to 2010. So for the previous 6 years, we're up towards the top. For the last 3 years, we've gone to 2nd last. So the UK was the only country that had a lower proportion of investment as a percentage of GDP. And it's clear in 2011 and in 2012 and perhaps 2013, we're going to be last. That investment will drop and fall below that. So the issue, if we get back to the original one, is what are we getting for it? So this is just a blow up of the previous slide, which is where we'd like to finish. Even with our investment so low, it's still staying quite high for the state. So government investment, the blue bar there, is still quite high. So although we're planning to drop relative to the Eurozone, we're still staying quite high. So we'll still be in or around the EU average. If we look at the expenditure on GDP, there's the EU average for the last 9 years. This is what we're planning to do. So we are introducing cuts, but maybe not below the EU average. So the issue is, what do we spend our public capital expenditure on? Well, 2/3 of it goes through local authorities. 1/3 goes through central government. And local authorities, about 1/4 of our investment goes on roads, or has up to now. 1/5 goes on the local authority housing stock, and 1/10 goes on the water treatment and water delivery systems. So that gets us up to about 55 or 60% of total investment by the state. What comes through centrally is building of schools, building of hospitals, and building of railways. So 2 out of 3 perhaps ain't bad for being useful. So in terms of the investment, we are planning to cut it hugely. And the issue is it an appropriate tactic to make? Is it one that's being forced on us? Or is these cuts in capital expenditure actually going to harm us in the long run? If we're trying to make budgetary adjustments and we focus all our attention on the capital budget, say, look, we'll cut that and we'll wait and see will the current budget come into line, is that going to leave us in a strong position? If the crisis is temporary, be over in a couple of years, that strategy may be successful and you can get back to previous levels of investment. But if the crisis is more ongoing and we face tighter controls, are we ever going to get back into a position where we have a greater freedom on the capital side? So over a 27-year period up to 2010, we spent about €12 out of every 100 the government spend on voted expenditure went on the capital side. So roughly an 88-12 split. Last year it was 92-8. So a greater emphasis on current expenditure. And over the next 4 years, it's going to be 6 versus 94. So the current budget is eating more and more of the proportion of voted government expenditure. This excludes anything to do with interest, it excludes anything to do with the banks. It's just the money the government spends on departments and government services. If we kept capital expenditure at the long run average for this year, it'd be over £6.5 billion. As it is, we plan to set capital expenditure at £4 billion. So much of the focus has been on the capital side in terms of cuts, in terms of reducing expenditure, and any improvements in the budgetary balance situation relative to previous years, where they take out all the banks, is on the capital side. So is the crisis temporary or permanent? So the last slide, the last picture, is the current account. If we don't get an improvement in the current account and continue to borrow for current purposes, Ronan made the point about borrowing for current purposes, that greatly reduces our ability to borrow for capital purposes, which should be beneficial, should be productive, and allows for greater scope. But over the last 3 years, we've made little or no improvement on the current account balance. So those 3 lines at the bottom are 2009, 2010, 2011. Basically a comparison between government tax revenue and government current expenditure. And the improvement is slight. For 2011, we're a bit above 2010, but not by a whole pile. So while the budget, or the deficit, has some suggestions of improving, it is primarily on the capital side. We're cutting hugely from the capital side, getting to the stage where as an economy, there will be no improvement or increase in the capital stock. Whereas on the current side, while there has been adjustments, they basically have been to keep the carnage as bad as it has been, rather than seeing any improvement. So the issue is, what type of decisions we want to make? So just to conclude, what elements in the current account, if we were to try and improve capital expenditure, could we transfer money from one source of expenditure to the other? It's pretty easy to stand up on a platform and say you should do this, that or the other. Clearly most of these are political decisions, but perhaps there is scope in the level of expenditure we have, rather than having to actually increase it much further, to transfer money from one to the other. So you can look at universal payments, such as perhaps child benefit, the near universal entitlement to the medical card for the over 70s, universal tax expenditures, such as mortgage interest relief, the complete non-taxation of sale of principal primary residence, which is very low at the moment, but is a universal entitlement, which could perhaps transfer money from one side of the budget to the other. Like, the issue is, where are we going to get most bang for the limited money we have? An equi-marginal principle is the last euro spent in the current budget, the 94th euro, is that providing more benefit than what will be the 7th euro in the capital budget? So we have made changes, but perhaps we're focusing a lot on the short term, a lot of the targets that have been set for us. Perhaps we should have maybe a longer term perspective, and the issue is, do we really have time for a longer term perspective? When looking at the banking details earlier on, like, some of the figures are fairly scary, and we are particularly in the most difficult place. But I think we should have sort of discussion, rather than trying to meet targets, what it is we're trying to achieve. So thanks very much.